Hi, this is Andy Revkin at the Earth Institute, Columbia University. This is Sustain What, which is a global conversation trying to forge progress along pathways that can build us a more resilient world, and right now help us deal more effectively in real time with this pandemic and its direct and indirect impacts. This is a work in progress. I started Sustain What 3 weeks ago, March 15th on a Sunday, as a way to engage in a global conversation to see how we can tweak things and then think about the grand challenges ahead as well, which include grand challenges for academia, grand challenges for economics, grand challenges for how we design healthcare systems, and of course, the grandest challenge of all, how do we navigate the Anthropocene, particularly staying within the boundaries of a climate system that are functional for us and functional for the rest of the living world. It's a pleasure to welcome back Herman Daly, Professor Emeritus at the University of Maryland, known to many here and for decades as one of the pioneering minds behind the idea that economics lives within an ecosystem. It's not like a separate thing. You don't tack on environmental regulation, and if you're not building that understanding of the way the planet works into how the economy that we build works, then we're always going to be hitting some frustrating points. So Herman, I thought we'd start with a little reflection from you on where things are now compared to a week ago when we had you and Kate Raworth here, who was also it was a wonderful gift to have the two of you representing two generations of thinkers and doers on ecological economics. And now we have a third generation we'll be speaking with today. So Herman, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Andy. It's good to be back, and it's good to meet Katie Kish and Katie Horner and Tim Crownshaw, and to see Jon Erickson again and you. One thing I just wanted to repeat from last time, that what I really want to congratulate you on the title of your show is Sustain What, because I think we get all tied in knots and get confused talking forever about sustainability. You know, it's an abstract noun. You're never quite sure just what it means. Some people make a step forward and make it an adjective and say, well, we'll talk about a sustainable something, and you tie it to reality, at least in that way. But you've gone all the way to make it a transitive verb. You know, something sustains something else. And that forces you to say, what is it that's being sustained and what is doing the sustaining? And I think keeps us thinking that it's the ecosystem that sustains the economy and not the other way around. So I like that way of approaching it.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah. Just as a matter of pure chance, this morning I got a email from a couple of graduate students at Vanderbilt University, which was my alma mater in the graduate school, and where George Rogan taught for many years, who was my teacher. And they were complaining or asking me, how come there's no trace left in the economics department of anything that George Rogan taught over the 20 years that he was there? And I must say I was not really surprised by that, but it's very sad. Mm. And I think this is, it got me to thinking, well, how much of a trace has been left in the places where I've taught? Goodness, if George didn't leave a trace, what's my chance? And I think back at Louisiana State University, well, the courses I started, they're all have been, left aside and abolished. There's no trace there of my 20 years. Then I was about 15 years at University of Maryland, along with, at the same time, Bob Costanza. Oh, yeah. And also there was a program in conservation biology there that was started by a couple of guys, Dietz and Inouye, I've forgotten their first names. But that was an extremely successful program, the conservation biology program. They got students into that program who had the highest, scores of any department in the university coming in. Well, what happened? Well, what happened? There's no longer any trace of anything that I did, or anything that Bob Costanza did, or of the conservation biology department, which was, in sort of an ally with us. Well, I think what happened in conservation biology was the biologists decided that ecosystems were kind of spooky. They didn't really perhaps exist even. What's real in the world is molecules. And so it was molecular biology, and you get down to this little fundamental units. That's what's real, and that's what you study. And so they phased out the conservation biology. It doesn't exist anymore, and it was extremely successful on a very small budget. So that's just an evidence of the power of the disciplinary organization of knowledge in universities, and how narrow it can be. Likewise, the ecological economics, which Bob Costanza and I set up a program, kind of a little minor program. That no longer exists. Well, the economics department, they control economics, and ecological economics is not really. So I just want to emphasize that I understand from the point of view of a student how difficult it is nowadays to find a curriculum in the area of ecological economics. You may well have to make your own in a certain sense. So I'd like to hear, I've been away from teaching now for about 8 years, so I'm out of date, and things may have changed. And so you can tell me what's going on, and I'd be very glad to hear it.
I would too, and we're going to go through the roster here. This is a great experiment that Jon Erickson, was it already 2 weeks ago? Jon is in the green room. You'll hear from him a little bit. He and a colleague of mine, Dale Willman, a good friend, also did a post-pandemic economics session for journalists. And then we did the one with Kate, and this has grown out of that because the questions and comments that came in, there were many from young people, including some of those on the stream today, saying, where do we go from here? So this is going to be a two-way conversation. I love that Herman is asking you guys too. And I just want to briefly offer the observation that I feel in the information environment we're in now, which is so constraining in many ways. We can't hug each other. We can't, really sit down in a corner and interact. We can create that curriculum that Herman just described, and we can create the co-learning and co-production of knowledge that's required by getting you all in a room here now and extending this into sub-Saharan Africa, and some of my friends in India working on the same concepts, and in Asia, Central Asia. So there's a great opportunity to do this, and it's not about breaking walls. It's like, screw the walls. Here we are, right? So maybe Katie, Kish, could you take the floor first and just lay out from your sense of where this field, this concept can go from here, and if you had questions or observations you wanted to throw toward Herman, that would be wonderful. And just describe where you are. Tell people literally where you are and a quick sketch of what you're doing.
So I'm actually in Kitchener-Waterloo, which is just outside of Toronto, kind of. It's about an hour out of Toronto. I'm a postdoc at McGill, but I live here because it's very easy to do these sort of telecommuting things these days. And I also work with the people at the University of Waterloo quite frequently, so it's kind of a smart spot for me to be in, and it's just where my family is, so it's where I needed to be. And for the last couple of years, I've been working on developing and disseminating a research agenda for emerging scholars, and working a lot with the scholars that are on the screen and many, many others to try and talk about what the future of ecological economics could really look like. Discussing it with people like Josh Farley, there was a sense that there's a bit of a changing of the guard in the discipline at this time, where it needs to be handed over, and we need to do that with ideas from people who founded the discipline while taking it in our own directions. And it's a very different group of people than the founders of ecological economics. They are geographically dispersed from all over the globe. Our last symposium, for the students, we had students from Iran and South America and India, and we are making our own curriculum. Really, at the symposium, we took this unofficial poll to see where people were coming from, what their backgrounds were. And there was, I would say, there was no one that had a background in biology, maybe a couple, and only a couple hands went up for a background in economics. It was very, very rare. Instead, we have anthropologists and sociologists and mathematicians and complexity scientists, and a lot of people with a multidisciplinary background. And actually in the Economics for the Anthropocene program, where I'm linked in with these students, there's a piece of that is to make their own course and to create a syllabus to look at questions that they are most interested in. So they actually are creating their own curriculum. And I think there needs to be more opportunity for that. But also this new cohort of scholars is really interested in questions of justice and in social changes. And I think that that's where they have the most area or expertise to contribute to the conversations that we see today. They want to apply everything, not just to the economic system or talk about ecosystem services or financing things. Rather, they want to look at the social system and see how best to start making that fit within the biosphere, and how to get the economy back into that social system, rather than the economy dictating how our social interactions happen over time. What's interesting, and I would definitely like to hear comments from other people and from Herman, is there's a big debate among students that it's regarding uncertainty. And so the students and postdocs work how best to balance a scale. And that's, on the one hand, how do we have a low energy throughput society? And on the other hand, doing that while maintaining the most important pieces of our socially progressive ideals. We like progressive ideals. We like that people and animals have rights, but we also have a stark recognition that there are limits on those ideas, and that those arose alongside a lot of this growth narrative, and we don't know how intertwined they are. But I think despite all of those major differences in approach, all new scholars see ecological economics as presenting a better option for the future, with a lot of accessible things for the public to grab onto. And so each of us on this call and many other scholars, we're working on different areas that really can represent a brighter future.
That's a great start. Hold on one second while I shift us back to the group. Katie, how much of what's happening right now feels like an impediment to the work that you've done so far, or a spur, or like a real-time opportunity? Because there's two things that have to happen at once. One is refining the field, refining the scholarship, and the other is being impactful in the world we know right now. So maybe the answer is, like so many, it's both, but is this a good moment or a challenging moment for this field?
It is both. And it's funny, a lot of people say, some of the work that I do and that some of my colleagues do is on societal or economic collapse, right? And here is this opportunity, and all of a sudden it's right in front of us, and we sort of don't know what to do. And there was this instinct to jump on it and start to act very quickly, do really rapid research. But instead we sort of stepped back, I did, and a few others, to look at it instead and sort of see what is actually happening, not just trying to apply our ideas and what we would like to happen, or, forcing it a little, and instead seeing what is emerging. Things like universal basic income and people working less, and what that actually did to societies, or is doing to societies and people, families, and individuals. And so it's giving us an opportunity to really see some aspects of degrowth or low growth in action. And I think that it is good, and it is an opportunity for us to bring together the different ideas that we have. So we've been trying to compile a lot of our research into a policy document to try and say, when this happens, we should be able to say, here's a policy regarding the care economy that could be implemented now, and it would be strong now, and it would help improve the future when we go forward, instead of things just flipping back to normal. And so we've been trying to do it that way, pulling on the research that we already have to create something that can be used, while also just observing it to see, degrowth in a way in action.
That's great.
Mm-hmm.
Herman, any quick thought before we go to the next person, and then we'll do sort of a circle?
Yeah, well, I think it's very important. The idea suggested that it's not just a matter of less throughput, but less throughput in a way that you are able to satisfy fundamental social objectives. I mean, we could just go to basal metabolism with very little throughput, and so it's not minimizing throughput, but minimizing it subject to the maintenance and enjoyment of life in an acceptable way. And that's once, I think, a step forward there has been made by Kate Raworth with that donut business. She has the outer limits, which are the sort of the biophysical limits on the system, and then the inner limits, which are the more ethico-social minimum that you have to achieve, and seeking a range within that. So I think that's one way of trying to deal with that important question of that balance.
Good.
Well, let me listen some more.
Yeah, okay. So maybe Katie number 2, Katie Horner. Tell people where you are in the world and what your particular lens is on this, and then offer some observations. That would be great.
Sure. So I am currently in Winooski, Vermont, which is kind of a subset of Burlington, Vermont. And I'm at home and feeling very grateful to be in a place where I have really easy access to a lot of food from farmers that I know, and access to lots of outdoor spaces. And I study agroecology. So before I entered graduate school, I worked on farms for 3 years. And I then went into a master's program in food systems, and now my PhD program is in a plant and soil science department, and I focus on agroecology, which is, broadly speaking, looking at agricultural systems as inherently embedded in ecosystems. And so I've been thinking a lot about how this pandemic is causing people to really look at and appreciate their food systems in different ways than they maybe have previously. And one of the things that has been encouraging amidst all of the kind of sadness and uncertainty is that we're starting to really assess who are the essential workers, and food producers and farm workers, and the migrant workers that a huge part of our food systems are really built on, are really starting to be acknowledged in terms of their importance for our day-to-day lives. And so I've been thinking about how that recognition might enable people to start to think differently about their agricultural and food systems, and kind of where they are, like how they're related to those systems. I think in general, outside of these crisis conditions, for a lot of people, it's easy to be a kind of passive consumer and not think too much about how we are all integrated within these systems of production. Been thinking a lot about that, and also about how the kind of injustices, both social and ecological, that really undergird a lot of our food systems as they currently exist, how those are starting to be acknowledged on a really wide scale. So thinking about how our food systems and our agricultural systems are integrated within our economy, and really, for a long time now, those systems have been subject to the economy. So food is a commodity. There's a lot of financial speculation that goes on, that causes a lot of price volatility within food systems. And I think that this is a moment to maybe say, and have people hear on a more widespread scale that actually our food systems should not be subject to economic systems, that in fact they're really foundational to our economies, because we all need to eat.
Right. There's a unit at Columbia, Michael Puma, a scientist at the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, which is linked with Columbia, who's coming out with a report this coming week on food security and COVID-19. And it's about all these interlinkages. And of course, on Monday, just to give you an example of how this knitwork can unravel and then re-ravel, I did a live segment with a citizen group in Bhopal, India, who I did a live segment with a citizens group in Bhopal, India, who realized that the poorest and the transients who were dislocated when they feared the lockdown have no cash, no work. They can't. Those who rely on a daily tiny public wage couldn't pick up their money, and so these people rapidly assembled a food system to cook and distribute dry goods to the community at need using WhatsApp and a guy who was basically driving from 7 a.m. until 1:30 in the morning every day, who was an accountant normally. So it's great to see how that can spring up. What would be wonderful is to hear more from you all on how much of the model will emerge from the bottom in a distributed way. How much of this is sort of observing and finding models that can be more widely applied, including technology, like in that case, WhatsApp or whatever, versus thinking of some grand top-down structure. As we go forward, that would be a really great thing to think about. Herman, any quick reactions there? And then we'll go to Sophie.
Yeah, it was very interesting, the points that Katie was making. When you talk about food or something that's absolutely essential like that, and that's where, it really hurts when there's a maldistribution. And some people, the poor, get priced out of the food market. And that's fundamentally much more serious than if they got priced out of the, some hula hoop market or something. So the question that occurs to me then is one of rationing. If food is scarce, then how do you ration it? Well, one way that, you might think that dollars would be rationing tickets. And the problem with that is dollars are so unequally distributed that it's a very unfair rationing system. So in wartime or critical times like this, we come in and let's issue ration tickets for these basic necessary commodities and distribute them on a more equal basis. Okay, that's what we did in World War II. I remember as a kid going in with ration tickets and dollars to buy milk and margarine. The other way of approaching it would be to say, well, let's keep dollars as the rationing tickets, but let's distribute them far more equally so that we don't need a double system. Mm-hmm. Let dollars be the rationing ticket, but let's have a maximum and a minimum on monetary income so that you don't have this extreme distributive inequality. And within that, you would then, keep the price system, but you would have distributed the income far more equally. So that's a question I would raise, for discussion, which is the better way to go to make the distribution of income far more equal and keep the market allocation, or to take essential things out of the market and use an independent rationing system.
Actually, before we move forward, Herman, could you just reflect one more minute or two on the special perspective people of your generation have on what's unfolding now in the context of earlier crises?
Well, I'm not sure.
Well, polio, there was polio, there were kids.
Oh, yeah.
There were so many instances in the past that we have we only have an indirect understanding of.
Sure. Well, I can speak to that because I'm a polio survivor. I had polio and have so at the time, polio was, nobody understood anything about it. They didn't know it was a virus. They didn't know anything about it. And so it was quite a panic. And they closed up all sorts of things, theaters and swimming pools and everything were closed. So there was this kind of social distancing that emerged because they thought it was highly contagious. Turns out it is contagious, but not highly so. So I guess one thing that's interesting about that, I'll mention since it ties in with what we were talking about before. Since polio is more or less over with now, at least in this country, historians have gone back and said, well, let's look at the polio experience as a whole and so forth. And when they do that, it's interesting. I was not aware until I read one of these histories that the money that was financed the research on the Salk vaccine was entirely voluntarily contributed.
That's interesting.
It was not a government program. It was March of Dimes. And I remember, you're in the theaters and during a break when they changed reels or something, the ushers would come in and pass the can around and rattle all the dimes, and everyone was supposed to contribute to the March of Dimes. And Franklin Roosevelt, appointed one of his top advisors to run the March of Dimes. I can't remember his name right now. So that was quite an amazing thing, that there was so much voluntary support. And well, that's one thing I mentioned. So the idea of voluntarism maybe it looks as if perhaps that's a parallel here with this current pandemic. There seems to be an outpouring of voluntarism to help. And that's something that I think economists need to look at much more and appreciate much more, because we tend to always put that last in the category.
And yeah, that came up the other day too, in the context of, there was a study recently demonstrating that the upside of the human, we tend to overestimate the downside of the human behavior. This was stated, I can't remember where I just saw this, but the people's perception of an issue like this is that it was because the modeling, right? The models were presuming a level of response that was pretty low, the models for mortality. And it turns out people actually have been responding in a very aggressive way to social distancing for much more than people thought they would. So that's one reason the mortality rates are lower than the projections. It's really interesting. Sorry.
Oh, and I guess the other thing on the pandemic and the thing, I was just reflecting the other day. Well, from what I've read in the 1918 case, the virus tended to favor younger people over older people. I mean, it attacked them more because older people had acquired some partial immunity from similar viruses in the past, whereas today that's not the case. Apparently, this virus is totally new, and I was thinking, I was just imagining a little convention of viruses deciding, hey, how shall we deal with this? Well, let's go. It was really easy to get these people on the cruise ships. They were all together. They're mostly old. Well, let's go for the old folks' homes now. That'll be easy. And we don't want to waste our time too much on the younger folks, because by golly, a lot of those, they're going to get over it and develop immunity. So that'll cut our future opportunities. So let's go after the old. Well, in a way, I suppose you might give the virus some credit, culling the old and the and the infirm does have a moral argument as opposed to culling the young who have not lived their lives yet. So I was just thinking how these viruses with no brains at all could be so smart.
Yeah. Katie, there were some questions that came in there, observations, and we were talking about this a minute ago too, just before we get to Sophie and to Tim, very focused on food and how we're seeing both in India and the United States with the dumping of milk, a very powerful demonstration of that challenge of production synced with need and distribution. Does any of that spring a quick thought into mind before we move forward?
I think that those comments are so important and really perceptive. And I think they really speak to the fact that an agricultural system that is completely controlled by capitalist markets and neoliberal policies is inherently unjust. And that they can really only get us so far. Yes, we can try and address things like distribution and supply chains, but these systems are designed to have winners and losers. And it's not that they're broken when we see things like the simultaneous existence of overproduction of certain commodities alongside people who are malnourished and not getting enough to eat. That's the way the system was designed to work. Because even when that's happening, the corporations and the so-called middlemen are still making profits. And so I think that those observations really point to the need for a different type of agri-food system that doesn't look at issues of the environment and economies and access as disparate. Those things are all interconnected. And so one of the reasons that I study agroecology, and I think it's so important, is that it offers an approach that honors that complexity and really acknowledges the fact that issues like hunger and resilient economies and viable ecological systems are all deeply intertwined.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, do you think that agroecology would be better served by small farms or the large systems? I mean, given the size of the scale of the agricultural units that produce, should we break those up or can they become agroecology oriented?
Yeah, that's a really common question, an important one, and I certainly wouldn't presume to know any kind of definitive answer. But I suppose from my perspective, I think that what we can learn from the study of ecology in general is that diversity is really important. And so having farms that are different sizes is one thing that I would say is important. I will point out that a huge majority of the farmers in the world are smallholder farmers. I think it's about 80%. And so the notion that small farms can't feed the world is, almost a contradiction in terms, because they already do.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that in terms of large farms, the issue to me isn't necessarily scale, but diversity. So I think one thing that's really dangerous is these huge farms that are monocropping, because that really introduces a lot of vulnerability into the system. And it also really serves to perpetuate the commodification of food. So these commodity products that can be speculated on and that can be stored and then dumped in other countries, that to me is more of a question and more of a concern than size itself.
Yeah. I'm not very well. I've read a lot of Wendell Berry, and I like his ideas very much on agriculture, but I don't have an independent background in that, so I'd be curious as to what folks in agroecology, how they react to Wendell Berry.
We'll circle back to that because there is a point I wanted to make related to the origins of the virus. But I'd love to get to Sophie now.
Sure.
Sophie, just give folks a thumbnail sketch of your particular lens on these questions of ecological economics and where you are in the world, and have at it.
Sure. So I'd like to start by thanking you, Andy. And of course, it's an honor to be sharing this platform with Herman and all of my good friends in the E4A and L4E program. And I would like to reiterate Katie's comments that, you know, we are all quite lucky to have this quiet space, access to internet and technology to communicate with each other and connect on these important topics. There's a lot of people who do not have access to these opportunities. I finished an undergrad in environment and business, which was all about integrating sustainability into business programs, CSR reporting, all of that. And when I finished that degree, I couldn't help but wonder, how is it possible to have a sustainable business in an unsustainable economic model? And that's the question that I kept coming back to. And fortunately came across this idea of ecological economics just when economics for the Anthropocene was starting up. And I was fortunate enough to be accepted into the program at York University as a master's student, where I was trained by Peter Victor. I also did an internship at the Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity in the UK with Tim Jackson, and was formally trained in ecological economics. And from there, graduated with way more questions than any answers. So I continued on my education in my doctoral studies here, where I am now at the University of Waterloo. And what I'm doing now is taking a care and ethics frame to really problematize some of the assumptions that ecological economics has made. In particular, the role of social reproduction, so the ability of people in households on an everyday basis to reproduce themselves. And my concern is that the distribution of risk and responsibility for a degrowth paradigm will fall disproportionately on vulnerable peoples, particularly women, migrants. So that's sort of where my research sits. I've also been extremely active in the larger ecological economics community lately. I am the vice president of research and education for the Canadian Society for Ecological Economics. And before that, I was the co-chair of the 2019 CANSI conference, which was all student-led for the first time. And it was a really exciting opportunity because this was a chance for us to express what we wanted from the discipline. So we did a lot of hard work as a team to not only promote and create a stage for the research, but really implement our values in the planning of the conference. And this is everything from partnering with local businesses that provided food and printing services for the conference. We provided free daycare to all of those conference attendees that needed it, especially women who are usually burdened with this chore. And we actually also organized a public events series that included a public lecture, a maker night with the local library, and the painting of a public mural. So all of these were activities that really broadened the spectrum of ecological economics so that we could engage not just with people in our own field and beyond people in our own field, but also with the general public. So that's sort of where I'm at now and what I've been up to.
Wow, I've learned a lot from Peter Victor too. I think he's really done a terrific job in carrying forward ecological economics and balancing with regular economics. I mean, he has a way of taking out of standard economics what's worthwhile and keeping it, and then bringing in the important concerns of ecological economics. So I wish I were young enough to join you in what you're doing. Sounds
You're
good.
always welcome, Herman.
Okay, thank you.
One of the bullet points in the list that your group of your sort of coalition here had assembled was the care economy, and I would like to hear a little bit more on that. Sophie, is that part of what you're concretely digging in on?
Yeah, absolutely. So this comes from a feminist perspective. Feminist economics has critiqued capitalism in the same parallel as ecological economics has critiqued capitalism. So ecological economics claims that our current market system is not properly acknowledging the environmental limits to economic activity. So in that same vein, feminist economics claims that the market systems do not account for the social reproduction of our societies. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I was muted there.
Well, you want to go ahead with others, and then I'll.
Yeah, let's. So Tim Crownshaw, right?
Yeah.
Where are you? And when you think of this question of ecological economics applied to where the human species is right now, and where someone of your generation is trying to find traction and workspace and knowledge building that can make a difference, where are you at?
Right. So I'm currently in Montreal. I'm a PhD student at University of McGill, but you can probably tell by my accent I'm not from here originally. I'm from New Zealand, and my focus is all about energy transition. So the dynamic pathways that we can undertake in order to get from a non-renewable energy resource basis where we are currently to a future renewable energy basis. So my background is in the physical sciences and engineering. So I'm approaching this problem from a very biophysical perspective. So I'm using systems modeling in order to investigate the different ways in which we could carry out this transition. And that's really important because it's not just a technical challenge or an economic challenge, but it is a path-dependent socio-metabolic process. So my research falls very much within the sort of broader arena of system science. So what I think is really important in all of this is that there are particular narratives out there about what we can achieve in energy transition, and I find that they are relatively simplistic, and they sort of assert what the possible outcomes are without actually looking at the sort of path-dependent metabolic processes that have to go on to achieve those outcomes. So that's the gap that I'm trying to address. Ultimately, energy is one of the pillars of a sustainable transition. If we don't get energy right, we won't get anything right. And so my view is that our prospects are much better if we tackle this broader transition with an accurate view of what is physically possible. From doing this work, because I'm using a physical perspective, which is often not the way that this problem is addressed, my research reveals a more constrained solution space than is often discussed. So, a lot of the narratives out there, such as coming from the Green New Deal, are at present overly optimistic. And I'm totally on board with the Green New Deal in every other way. I just think that if we approach this from a more physically based, scientifically sound perspective, we will inevitably achieve better outcomes.
That's such an important point. Sorry, Herman. Go.
That's extremely important. And I must say, I really go along with that. I've tended to, economics is the application of scarce means to the satisfaction of alternative ends. And so, what are means? And I think that gets you right back into the very biophysical, following Georgescu-Roegen, the fundamental, as I see it, ultimate means of low entropy matter energy. And so how that gets used by technology to produce intermediate means, which are then used to satisfy intermediate ends like clothing, food, shelter, health, and how those intermediate means are ranked in a ethical hierarchy. Which ones do you satisfy first in the event of scarcity? That gets you into ethical problems at the higher end of ethics and means. So I think I see a very interesting difference in starting points. It's some of the two Katies who have spoken and Sophie have talked a little bit about. It seemed to me starting from an ends and working down the hierarchy or down the spectrum. And Tim, you start seems like from the bottom, from the limitation of means, and work up, and you'll meet in the middle somewhere, I guess. And and I think that's a real good way of going about it.
There's something I want to show you. Resources for the Future at the end of 2018 did it was like one of the most, you could call it depressing, studies about energy and history and where we go from here. And it was basically arguing that there has not yet been any sign of an energy transition. That basically the concept of an energy transition is hypothetical, in the sense that most of our energy transitions have been additive, and that's where I point to it a lot in the context of what you said about the Green New Deal. When I wrote about the Green New Deal for National Geographic, right the first week when it came out, I was championing it. But I was championing the words in it that weren't getting a lot of attention, which are the words that imply this is not an easy path, that the data-based approach, that those words, path dependency, are so challenging. And this was what was said in the Resources for the Future paper, that again, in the big picture, these historical changes in our energy system have been a matter of addition, not transition. The world has never experienced an energy transition, but the challenge of climate change means that for the first time, one will need to begin. Is that when you talk about having a data-based approach, are those the kinds of things you're operating within, that kind of concept?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's true that we haven't had a transition like this ever in human history. And from a big picture perspective, we're currently living through a carbon pulse. We developed the necessary technologies to access an extremely large store of exergy. We've aggressively utilized that exergy to build up an enormous industrial civilization. And where we go from here, it's very easy to be complacent about it and just to say, well, our technology will continue improving and we'll switch to renewables. But renewables are, from a physical perspective, they are lower quality energy resources. They're more flow limited, and this goes back to the ideas of Georgescu Rogan, where if we have a large stock of fossil fuels under the ground, we can access it at any rate we want and we can exploit it aggressively. You can't do that in the same way with renewable energy. They also have a much lower energy return. They produce primarily intermittent electricity, which is not really what our industrial system requires, and so we are being forced into the very uncomfortable situation of having to transition to a lower quality energy basis. And that has not only technical implications, but societal implications in terms of, questions of societal complexity, questions of continuity, raising the prospect of collapse. Can we carry this out? Is there a feasible path that exists? So I think these are questions that don't get nearly enough attention, and we really do need to consider these if we want to be well informed about what the future holds for us.
I'd be curious to hear Herman reflect on that in the context of biology. Well, I was saying to myself and to some people a while back, is there a species on the planet that does not crave more energy? In other words, an energy addition life is always, it means more food, more access to X, Y, and Z, more. I'm saying, thinking about the externalities is sort of almost secondary to that, the primacy that energy makes life better.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure. I wanted to say one thing about the renewable. You hear so much emphasis on switching to renewable energy. That is as if our energy problem were just a matter of shifting from non-renewable to renewable energy. The difficulty I see with that is, renewable energy becomes non-renewable if you exploit it beyond its sustainable yield. I mean, you can wipe out renewable sources of energy, and that depends upon the scale of the system, how much you're taking from it. So I think that the idea has to be framed in some way about what scale of the economy, of the offtake of renewable energy can we live on. What would be a renewable energy budget? I used to think in terms of the substitution. If we're going to substitute away from petroleum and on to, let's say, grain alcohol, well, that's a good idea, except if you really try to keep the same scale that you were supporting with petroleum on the basis of grain alcohol, you'll use up all of the surface of the land producing the grain alcohol and won't have any left for food. So it's, I think that we have to get back to the idea of growth as if we insist on maintaining a growth program, then whether we do it with renewable or non-renewable, we're going to ruin either one of them under the growth regime, or so it seems to me. So I think we have to first get at this idea of limiting growth, and then within those scale limits, figuring out the kinds of energy sources which fit. And going back several times, the idea of degrowth has been mentioned, and I think that's a very necessary thing. I think we're currently at a scale that is too large to maintain by any source of energy that we see on the horizon. And so we're going to have a period of degrowth or of decline in scale. But I would really like to frame it as, degrowth to what? And I would say degrowth to a steady state economy at a sustainable level. So I don't see any difference between, or any conflict between, the degrowth position and the steady state position. Because if you frame it as degrowth is necessary now to a steady state, because we don't want to keep on degrowing all the way to zero. So that would be a way of framing that issue that I would like to keep on the front burner. And also, one thing we haven't talked about in terms of growth and degrowth and so forth and energy and food is population.
Right.
That was something which I guess was at the very beginning of concerns about sustainability, at least in the early 70s. The big thing was population growth and worrying about sustainability there. That sort of dropped out of the picture. Nobody wants to talk about population growth anymore or population stability. So I'm just curious as to, with the new scholars, are you wanting to put that back in the picture, or are you the ones who have taken it out?
That's a great question. I'm going to pause for a second because I'm going to pop out of the picture here briefly so that Jon Erickson can come take the driver's seat for maybe about five minutes or so. That issue of, to me, some of this gets back to what we were talking about with Kate a week ago, where the curves, she has the Doughnut Economics. There's a lot of depictions of the future as this steady state circular process. And I was proposing the possibility that if we flip the dimension temporally, and you think about what's happened as a kind of what Tim was talking about, we've been in a fossil fueled surge that is implicitly temporary. that's more like a breaking wave on a beach, and it's sort of like with COVID-19. Can you flatten can you flatten the curve? Can you sort of what can you do to temper the wave? And then it will settle into a world like folks at IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, do these 200-year modeling exercises showing that there are pathways to a world of 2 billion people with widespread well-being in the year 2300 that don't include a absolute calamity between now and then. So that is this a wave to manage that we know is temporary because fossil fuels are temporary, or is it something different? But so I'm going to step back, let you all cogitate on that, and John will come in. Hold on one second.
All right. Hi, everyone.
Hey, John.
It's been great to be backstage listening to this conversation. Thanks so much. Maybe I'll just say, Herman, it's really a pleasure to have you talk to our rising emerging scholars. I was in their position, except for Katie, who's now out of grad school. I was in their position in grad school 25 years ago when I first discovered your work. And, I was wandering aimlessly between my studies of ecology and my studies of economics, and just pulling my hair out saying, how can these two disciplines exist and be talking about the same world? And I came across this book in a free book pile by Herman Daly, Economics, Ecology, and Ethics, Essays Towards a Steady State Economy. And I said, wow, I didn't know that such a thing existed. So thank you for launching my career in ecological economics. And it's wonderful to have our students now be way ahead of where I am these days and thinking about these things.
Yeah, that is wonderful to see the progress. And it's interesting to me thinking about how I came to this, and you and Josh Farley and John Gowdy and Peter Victor and others. We all kind of started out in economics, and we were dissatisfied with economics. And so we looked into other fields to try to find the solutions to our dissatisfactions. I'm getting the impression, listening to you younger folks, that you didn't really start it with economics. Usually you started with other fields, and you're sort of going into looking from the point of view of these other fields to economics. Hey, why can't you do something to help to deal with the problems with these fields? Why are you making things worse instead of better? Or at least how can we change economics so that it'll do a better job with the particular agroecology, energy, whatever area that I've been interested in. So I'm curious if that's just a small sample observation, or if that applies to more of your generation, that you're coming to ecological economics from other fields and not so much from economics.
Katie Horner, I wonder if you could reflect on that. We've had you in courses in ecological economics, but you're doing your PhD in plant and soil science. So what draws you to ecological economics from a different field?
Well, I think that one of the things that I see as a huge roadblock to realizing a more socially and ecologically just and viable food system is the current capitalist market paired with neoliberal policies. And I think that for agroecology to scale up and scale out, it really requires supporting institutions. And that means economic institutions, and that means political institutions that are aligned with the principles of agroecology and the values in terms of valuing stable livelihoods and vibrant communities and healthy ecosystems. So what draws me in is really the potential I see for ecological economics to offer up these institutions that can support different ways of doing things, that can actually kind of create the structures that we need on a much bigger level to create these new systems that we really need.
Yeah. That, I was thinking, going back to your thoughts, and also Tim was saying about energy. I remember one of the conundrums that came up years ago, people talking about energy. They said, well, what should we do in policy-wise? Shall we raise the price of energy in order to induce greater efficiency and economizing and improve technology? So let's raise the price of energy. And they said, oh no, we should subsidize, we should lower the price of energy for the sake of the poor, because it will be a particular hardship on the poor to pay higher prices for such an important thing as energy, which gets reflected in everything. So this went back and forth, and some argue one way and some the other way. And then it seemed to me that the resolution, which I think ecological economics more or less accepts, is, well, hey, we've got two policy problems here. Two policy problems. One, let's raise the price for the sake of efficiency. We need efficiency. We don't want to have cheap energy and all the costs that induces. But let's raise the price either through ecological tax reform or through cap auction trade systems. And so we'll tax away this increased price, which is necessary for efficiency. And then what will we do with the revenue from the increased price, or the auction revenue? We'll redistribute that to the poor. We'll redistribute that progressively to deal with the problem of the extra burden on the poor. So it seems to me that these kinds of connections are possible, and that we can do this. And I wonder if that fits with now. I've recently received let me back up. Ecological economics is used to being criticized from the right, from the neoclassical growthist economists, right-wing criticism. We're not so used to getting criticized from the left, but that's been coming from some neo-Marxist folks recently, and they don't like the idea of markets. They don't like the idea of prices. And so that at that point, I say, well, wait a minute. I'm all in favor of more social justice, of greater equality in the distribution of income. But when you go all the way to central planning as opposed to Marxist, then I sort of recoil and say, wait a minute, let's look at history. What happened with the war communism efforts of the early Soviet Union. They had to back off from the abolition of markets. What happened to the collectivization of agriculture? Now, that was a big failure. So, and how are you going to handle the huge information problems of central planning? So I would say markets are necessary, although certainly not sufficient. We need a whole lot of planning to keep markets as good servants rather than bad masters. And so I wonder how you react to what I think of as a kind of ecological economic principle of raising the price for the sake of resources, basic resources, for the sake of inducing efficiency, and capturing the rent, the resource rent, and redistributing that for the sake of equity. Does that make sense, or does that many people, I think, don't buy that, and so I'd be interested in to hear your views.
Are you asking me?
Oh, I'm asking anybody.
Well, maybe someone else wants to take that.
I can reflect on that a bit because I've been in the middle of this carbon tax question here in Vermont as a really big campaign over the last 3 years of trying to get carbon taxes instituted, and a campaign that includes the environmental groups and the climate change groups, but it's also included low-income groups and groups that are really sort of leaning into the carbon tax question in order to invest those rents in home weatherization, invest those rents to help low-income households and communities wean themselves from fossil fuels, right? Because the fossil fuel economy is a dead end, especially for the most vulnerable in society. So I think that follows along your line of thinking. I might kick this over to Katie Kish, because I think these sort of false dualisms or false narratives between only markets or only central planning kind of gets us in trouble, right? And that's what I've learned a lot from you, Herman, is that the sole focus of efficiency in mainstream economics crowds out discussions around frugality or around redundancy or the importance of diversity, the importance of equity, these kind of multi-tiered strategies to create more resilient economies, especially reflecting on the current crisis that we're in. And I know Katie's given a lot of thought around relocalization, redefining work, redefining production. That isn't just this kind of myopic understanding of efficiency.
Yeah, and it's the nice thing about EE is that it presents a lot of solutions in a lot of different ways. And Sophie, at the last conference we had here, the Cansey National Conference, was here in Waterloo. She really helped to show that there were coalitions to be had on both sides. And I think that production is actually a really good one to focus in on, to show that it doesn't really need to be politicized, and we don't need to have these dualisms. Localized production is both a conservative and a liberal platform, because if you're producing locally, then you have people who want to bring production back home. That was sort of a Trump platform, really, that there is production back home. And then also on the sort of more liberal eco side, people who are makers and joining maker spaces and selling their things at local markets and at their community centers and on Etsy, they're also doing local production. They're internalizing the process of production. And so the nice thing about this group of people is that there are these dualisms, but we recognize that we work in different directions and different approaches to these solutions. And we try to celebrate that kind of difference between the scholars, because it makes the whole approach more robust in the end of it all. So Andy was talking about things about if things can be top down or bottom up, right? He mentioned almost an hour ago that was an interesting thing to think about. And so for me, I think it is all community-based, basically. I think that top-down stuff isn't going to work. And these larger questions about markets have to emerge at what communities need. So we have heard many, many times in many conversations that crashes in systems are peak moments for opportunities. And we hear this in systems theory all the time, that opportunity can be taken up by adjacent possibles or shadow networks or just alternative systems that are happening. That can only really work if we are practicing prefigurative politics at the community level. We need to have people living the kind of life that they want to see in a new kind of society. And that's almost certainly community oriented. Things like groups like Food Not Bombs and outschooling initiatives and community gardens, this kind of stuff. It's an important and substantial task, really substantial, for individuals and communities to go against the grain and live the practice of their movement, so that relationships and political forms of the desired society are already in action for when moments like this emerge, moments like this as in the pandemic. So imagine that 50 people in my suburb, because I live in a very traditional suburb, had community gardens. This would be a huge opportunity for a new, essentially non-market food system based on reciprocity and trade to take hold. And so they're already becoming aware of the kind of limitations that transition takes, and what it means to live with less, because they're already doing it in their community. Katie Horner mentioned that there are winners and losers, and we can almost always predict who the losers are going to be. So I don't have a lot of faith in the top-down activities working for people like those in my suburb. But but there are scholars in our group that would completely disagree with me, and that's great.
Well, I think that someone just commented in the Facebook Live on that markets aren't free, right? And that they really require good governance, good institutions, investments by society to make markets do what they're supposed to do. But also, not everything that is good for society happens in markets, right? There's huge parts of the informal economy, the non-market economy. And Sophie, I know you've given a lot of thought on the gendered nature of production in relationship to this conversation, especially in relationship to this moment that we're in. Maybe you can reflect on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to caution, like, of course, we want to be bringing production home, but there are very sort of gendered dilemmas or dynamics that come with that. For example, we know right now on an international scale that women perform over 3/4 of unpaid care work. That's over 12 billion hours a day unpaid that they're spending reproducing our society. And this goes all over the world. For example, in the UK, men do 60% less housework than women and subsequently enjoy 5 more hours of leisure. In the United States, women are doing twice as much household work. And they also find that in households where there's a female breadwinner, the male partner will actually experience a gender role threat and do even less work to sort of preserve their masculinity. And at the same time, female breadwinners are more likely to take on more care labor, while male breadwinners are half as likely to do so. So there's this really interesting division of power that goes on, while women do sort of the everyday, the maintenance, the continuing, but men are able to withhold the decision-making power. And this goes beyond just the household. There's some really interesting work out of the Penn State University that looks at climate policy and finds that if climate policy is proposed from an ethics and justice perspective, it's seen as feminized and becomes sort of an ethics-based argument. And business frames are much more favored over ethics frames because ethics-based policy is seen as weaker. So these are just some interesting dynamics that I've come across, some observations on Katie's comments.
That's very interesting. I don't know, haven't gone into that very much, but something very similar when I was first teaching in Northeast Brazil, where I really got into the population issue, because at that time, and that's a very poor area of Brazil, and this was back in the mid or later 1960s, and there was an enormous rate of population growth and an extreme class differential in the rate of population growth, rate of fertility. So that the upper class fertility, maybe completed fertility, was like maybe 4 children. Lower class was 8, or sometime around average. And that led me to the sort of the thinking, and I got into Marxist theory of exploitation and so forth. And it looked to me, this is kind of a little wild, but go with me for a minute, that Marx saw exploitation as taking place in the factory. You increase the length of the working day beyond what was necessary for subsistence for the labor, and you kept the difference. So it was, the labor was, in the household, it looked as if you take a Marxist position, that there's a exploitation going on, because the household is reproducing not only not only the same number of labors per generation, but an increase. So how shall I say? Go back to the meaning of the word proletariat. In ancient Rome, the proletariat was the poorest class, which was useful only for the propagation of children, of workers, and not paying taxes. So proliferation and proletariat, the verbal connection is still there. Then Marx comes along, or even before Marx, and proletariat gets redefined simply as the poorest class. And the connection with reproduction, with excess fertility, is left out. So it seemed to me, looking at this kind of as a foreigner, that excess, that this is another, or a kind of Roman exploitation here going on. The household is reproducing not only its own replacement, but a larger number of workers to be exploited the next go around. So that was kind of my first introduction to the notion of household exploitation. The feminist movement, I think, has I don't know if to the extent to which the feminist movement has considered differential reproduction in their notion of household labor exploitation. They seem to be more focused on care and household chores and cooking and cleaning and so forth. But I'd be interested if that idea of differential reproduction is, well, I guess it is, with family planning, it gets built into that in some way. But I'd be curious to hear what you think of that.
Can you define what you mean by differential reproduction?
Well, I mean that the upper class where I was observing in Brazil, they controlled reproduction in the household. They had the means of contraception and the cultural capacity to use it. The lower class was pretty ignorant, and they didn't even have at that time access to contraceptives. Nowadays, contraceptives are available on open display at supermarkets, but back then they were not, and you couldn't find them unless you really. And so that was. So that's what led to, you had uncontrolled reproduction in the household.
Yeah, I definitely think it's on the population conversation. I think we should think about sort of the environmental footprint of various regions.
It's very bad. I'm not getting it.
Say that one more time, Katie. What was that, Katie? Oh.
I think Herman was just frozen for a bit.
Okay. Herman, can you hear us now?
Are other people able to hear? I'm not.
I think maybe it's better now. There was a, can you hear us now, Herman? Oh, maybe not. Are you all okay? Good. I think he's coming back. I see, Herman, can you hear? I wonder if he hit a setting or something. Well, we're getting to a point here where we want to kind of round toward some concluding. Right, maybe he'll pop back in. Sometimes just re-engaging will be good. Some concluding ideas, and thank you, Jon Erickson, for joining in there for a while. It's been this is always illuminating for me, and it's good to step out too and let other people shape things. So, what would be a next step that you could take in this effort you're doing to not just build a curriculum, but shape your own careers going forward? You know, right now, and can I help you in some way? Can we work together? And probably enlisting across way more campuses too. Obviously, what would a share and sort of a plug and play curriculum look like? That, as I said earlier, where you don't have to worry about breaking disciplinary boundaries, where you can kind of build the ecosystem of learning yourselves. There's path dependency there, just like in the economic world. Is there a model for that to go forward? Maybe Katie, what do you think when you think about the lessons here? This great disruption that's underway right now with COVID-19 is disrupting academia in ways that could lead to a less wall-bound approach to what we do. So maybe weigh in, each of you, a little bit on what your next steps might be, or questions for the broader community here.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of different opinions and different things that people have to say to one another right now. And it would be great if there was a lot of open dialogue online. that was free to that was free to access and free to talk about, and that people could engage with it in conversation. And there's a lot of room and a lot of opportunity for that. And I think as we're seeing how useful and how easy this sort of online model and online conversations can be, it's going to get easier for us to transmit different ideas across different borders and in different places. Education has a long way to go at a whole bunch of different levels. I'm working with elementary kids to try and get them using their brain more and making more and just approaching that differently. But I know that there's some on here that have opinions on higher education, and so I think Katie would be able to talk to that.
So Katie, what do you think?
Well, I think that one point I want to make is that even though I think it's been incredible to see the way that educators have shifted to teaching online very quickly, and even though I know that there's a huge amount of benefit that we can draw from connecting across time and space online, I also think that a huge shift that needs to happen in higher education is that it really needs to become more place-based. I think that when we talk about things like ecology and agriculture and justice, there's only so much you can learn about those things by reading and writing and talking. I think you really need to experience your world to understand it. And I think the same is true for understanding ourselves. So I think that experiential learning and reflective practices are something that really need to get integrated into curricula across disciplines within higher education. And I think that this is a really profound moment to consider that, because students everywhere should really be given the space right now to reflect on what they're experiencing and how their world is changing, and how that's impacting people in different places in very different ways. So I think that those two things are things that I hope we can focus on more in the future. And then for my own focus in terms of agroecology, I think that we can talk about valuing other ways of knowing, but a real way to act that out, to really actualize that valuing, is to bring in farmers and activists and food producers, bring them into the fold of the academy. So starting to really break down the barriers of who we consider an expert and who we think has knowledge that is worth sharing with students in undergraduate and graduate programs is also going to be really important going forward, because we're going to need to get really creative to solve the crises we're facing, and we're going to need people of lots of different types of knowledge and experiences to do that.
Yeah, and actually I would offer that can happen. It is happening to a certain extent further down the education pipeline in secondary and even primary school. If you go on Twitter, and there's an organization called PBL Works. I think it's one word, PBL Works. It's place-based learning, professional development for teachers in secondary and I think even primary school. There's a guy named Jim Bentley who's a trainer who's also affiliated with National Geographic. My wife works in that arena too, a little organization called, it's CELFeducation.org. They do professional development with teachers on how to, within the constraints of the classroom, within the constraints of today's education system, it gives teachers ways to just tweak their lesson plans just a little bit in a way that can get some more of that in. And that's also, I think that's another example of this bottom-up distributed capacity, teacher-to-teacher capacity building can happen as well. And you're basically the incarnation of an effort to do this as sort of at your level of scholarship, young people still seeking your positions in life and in academia, who are, you're kind of like forging a discipline whether it wants to be there or not. This reminds me of what's happened in architecture schools too. Ed Masria was an architect down in the Southwest who was really pushing hard for a new model, a new architecture 2030 curriculum where you don't design a building, you don't do your master's thesis without doing the full life cycle analysis of your design. And what's happened is that the students are not going to go to a school or become faculty at a school that doesn't have the flexibility to soften disciplinary walls and do those kinds of things. So I think this is really an encouraging aspect of this conversation today. I think if you widen this circle even more, I'm happy to help through what I do is just the communication part. I'm kind of like a professional middle child, right? Constantly telling people to talk to each other and work it out. So I think this can really be a stimulation zone for getting some more plasticity where it's needed. So Herman, you're back with us. So thank you. I know there was
I don't know what happened. I'm sorry. It took me a while to figure out how to get back on.
Here you are. It's been a pleasure and an honor twice now to have you on this experiment in communication innovation through the Earth Institute. And we have about 4 more minutes. So there's time for a final thought from each of you, perhaps, on there's a guy named Jeremy Zilar, Zilar, who we used to work with me at the New York Times, designing blogs. He worked in the government, digital.gov, helping government websites be more effective at serving the people who pay for them, meaning all of us. And he's sort of he's nudging the whole world to think about ways to communicate better. So he was on the very first one of these programs I did on March 15th, Sunday, however many weeks ago. And he said, what the thing to think about each day or week is, what's the thing I can do tomorrow or today, or that can actually nudge a needle 5%, something about like getting who's on your mind. We think about who else could be part of this conversation, who isn't, or just what Katie Horner was saying about inclusion, having a farmer in a conversation here. I just did that, by the way, last Sunday. My arts session had a friend of mine who's a sheep farmer in rural Massachusetts, and she was emphasizing the importance of the telephone. As we were saying, not everybody's on the grid, and some elders and the poor, won't have the gift of having this connectivity. So let's go around the circle, ending with Herman. Maybe Katie Horner. Is there some aspect, something you thought of in the last hour and a half that makes you think of a path forward that's slightly different today than it was yesterday? What's your final manifesto coming away from this?
Wow, what a big question.
And it doesn't have it. You can say I'm cogitating. You don't have to. There's no reason to force the issue.
Well, I think one thing is just how important it is to have conversations like this with people who have really different perspectives, to try and both become better practitioners of speaking across difference and also start to really draw from the creativity that can come from those spaces. And just have only looked briefly at some of the live comments that are coming in, but there's just a huge opportunity for creative learning that comes from this kind of thing. And I suppose the other thing is, the power that comes from vulnerability, from people admitting what they don't know, which can then open up this kind of conversation. And I think that that's also a change that I really hope to see more within academia going forward, is kind of a changing of what we think of as expertise and the roles that experts play. And then also kind of how we take on responsibility for ideas getting translated into action. And so we all know that the science for addressing climate change and the ideas for how to address food insecurity, all of that analysis has existed for decades. And we really need to start honoring process and dialogue to try and figure out how that research and that work and that thinking can be applied in a really impactful way to start to work together towards creating a world that works better for more people and for ecosystems around the world.
Great. Tim, do you have a final thought for this day?
I guess when I look at where to go from here, there's an enormous level of uncertainty, and I think that a lot of us, we've had discussions about this, a lot of us grapple with this issue of, is academia the right place for us? Are we, is there support for these sorts of ideas? Is it the best place to invest our energy? And there's also a tension between research and research communication. And, some of us don't have both of those skill sets and kind of feel like investing a lot of energy into the communication aspect is just sort of shouting into the void. And I guess I deal with that. I wonder if there is a future in academia where there will be supportive of these sorts of ideas. A lot of us are coming at these problems with very what might be considered unconventional approaches, and that there tends to be a bit of resistance there. So yeah, I mean, I guess my view of, Katie, as you mentioned, these ideas have been out there for decades, and we haven't really shifted the needle. So are we going to now? Are we going to in the midst of the crisis? Maybe, maybe not. But yeah, not to an optimistic perspective, but I guess there's just a large degree of uncertainty, and I don't know the best way to approach it, where to invest, my time and efforts. So I hope that a movement can come out of this and can drag some of us along in a more productive direction. But honestly, I don't know.
That's part of everything in the world right now, is that dealing with deep uncertainty. There is this Society for Decision Making under Deep Uncertainty, deepuncertainty.org, which is trying to normalize that. A big part of how we will move forward has to not try to think we can always tamp it down or solve it. That those are fundamental aspects of the human experience with all of our science and technology. So it's good to embrace it and find a way to feel comfortable with it. Seems to be important. Katie Kish and then Sophie, can you offer your final thoughts for this day? Again, this is not final. Nothing about this is final. This is iterative and an exploratory.
Yeah. So I mean, Tim and Katie are right. That these aren't new ideas, but I do think the way that we are pulling them together and the way that we are engaging with the ideas is a lot different and has evolved a lot, even just from when I did my undergraduate. So the way that we bridge these disciplines is new. It's been highly siloed for a long time, and we've done a really good job at breaking that down, which is why we have sort of complex debates that involve energy throughput and ethics and sociology, all of these different pieces, and everyone feels like they have a different expertise to bring to that. And so instead, we need to find ways where we can have opportunity to co-evolve those ideas. And I don't think we've gotten really good at that yet. We all have lots of ideas and we all come together from different points, and we all have this really good expertise or this emerging expertise that we would like to put towards these larger debates, but there's not a really good way for us to really put them together yet. And so that I think that needs to be a little bit of a focus. But also, I mean, the Economics for the Anthropocene program and now the Leadership for the Ecozoic program is a great demonstration of one way, at least, to do some of that, because it's not just learning how to do research or learning how to be an ecological economist, but it's about they have intentionally created a community of researchers where some can research and some can communicate, but we're all supporting each other's work and each other. The way that I'm coping the most with this pandemic is to socialize online with that community in different ways. And so we need to find ways to amplify the things that we're doing right outside of our program, and to get that to be the norm in institutions rather than continuing to have people in these, all these different disconnected disciplines.
I misspelled ecozoic in my fast typing, but I just included a comment with the link that people can click back to. This will all be stored as an archive of videos, which is great. No one has to scribble notes very quickly. So Sophie, lots has been said that's powerfully related to your thinking and your doing. What's your...
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to start by definitely following up with you offline on collaborating in the future. CANSI will be hosting a student symposium this summer training some students, and we're hoping to have a particular curriculum around communicating our scientific ideas to policymakers. So that's something hopefully we can do. I definitely think that ecological economists need to better engage with traditional economists and start engaging on that platform and breaking down those silos. We know, all of this information is out there, but we know that currently no country satisfies its citizens' basic needs while within the planetary boundaries framework. And at the same time, we cannot reach our climate goals if GDP growth continues in all countries. So it's not whether we choose to shift to a low carbon economy, but whether we're going to do so voluntarily. And it's going to be those leaders, whether municipal or otherwise, that protect their citizens in this unstable climate future. And I would like to shout out to Amsterdam as the first municipality on the planet to officially adopt the Doughnut framework in its policy goals. And it's going to be orienting its policies around these social and ecological foundations. And I think that's an excellent start.
I've just posted, by the way, another link. I'd like to aggregate some other parallel efforts that are underway I also mistyped again. HKW it's a German museum in Berlin that has this Anthropocene curriculum. It's really an interesting, it's more of a geography focused, I'd say, but the more interlacing and intercomparison can be done, the better. So Herman, you have the last word here.
Yeah, well, first I want to thank you for bringing it right
one way in the word, but you're still spilling your learning and you're still learning here. I could hear you asking as many questions as you're answering. So what's your takeaway here?
Well, my takeaway is I'm encouraged to see the quality of thought that is emerging now and people are doing. I'm sort of stuck in the old world of print communication and all of this business of social media is new to me, and I'm trying to hang on to it and learn about it. But I do see, I've been disappointed in the past with the ability of universities to change or to accept something new like ecological economics or and this what John Cobb and I in our book For the Common Good, we talked about the disciplinary orientation of knowledge, the disciplinary structure of a university. And it's very hard to break out of that. And I think what you're doing is breaking out of it and bringing these silos together. And I think the new technology of social media is certainly going to help, I think, break the walls of the university in a good way. So I agree with Tim that there's an awful lot of uncertainty right now. My thought though is when you're uncertain, when you don't know where you're going, slow down, and we can do that. I think we can agree to that growth is not the way out of things, and maybe really confront the growth paradigm strongly, and then work out whatever differences remain within that level of agreement. That's my hope. Thank you very much.
That's a great hope. I'm going to conclude by reading something just very brief. It's a little boilerplate. Sustain what? So here here's this thing. It's an active process. It's a journey. Deborah Brosnan, who was on here recently, who's a masterful analyst of disaster risk, she said that she described resilience as a process. It's a verb. It's not a phenomenon. And I think what we're looking at here is a verb too. This whole process we're doing, exploring new ways to connect across distance. And so what I'm trying here is a global conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration. Prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. The one Earth system changing faster than the actual environment is the one we're using to connect with each other today. This webcast is produced by Columbia University's Earth Institute, where we're building a new initiative on communication and sustainability. My daily question is, how do you make information matter and connections? So far, the internet has been used to divide, to distract, very effectively, entertain. Those are all, some of those are good, some of those are bad. So how can we fast forward our path toward a slower, more reflective, more empathic, more inclusive lives for our communities and the world at large? For the time being, these sessions will be focused on mitigating the unfolding societal disruption and devastation driven by COVID-19 pandemic. But we're going to go into all the other areas that are bundled in that concept of sustainability going forward, but always by asking the question, sustain what? Thank you for being here, especially the new generation. There's always a new generation. And I'll leave you with this one cartoon that was such an awesome expression of the moment. So this is from a statistically cartoon Instagram account, and I couldn't quite figure out who that is. So you can see two scientists looking at the very familiar flatten the curve thing over on the left side of the screen. But when you zoom out, you realize there's this much bigger curve, the Great Surge, which has a similar question. Can we flatten that curve? And then what comes next for us and for other species? Thank you all, each of you, for being part of this today. It was very special. And there'll be more. Tomorrow, just so everyone knows, at 11 a.m., I'm doing a session on national security, on intelligence and decision-making, and how it's actually, the pandemic was predicted, right? We know this very well. But to a certain extent, that doesn't, it's too easy to blame President Trump for the failure. The failure is a systems failure. The same thing happened with 9/11 and other big risks that we face. And climate change on a bigger scale. So how do we work on that? On Sunday, we're having another one here with Dar Williams, great songwriter, Vince Bell, another one. I think Chuck Leavell, who's the Rolling Stones keyboard player, will use Sunday morning broadcasts on this platform to take a breath and collect stories and share experiences through the arts. And onward into the next week. And again, thanks to all of you, including Jon Erickson, who's off screen now, but who helped facilitate this in a big way at the University of Vermont at Gund Institute. And that's it. Thank you. And have a good day and stay safe and connect with each other as best as you can.
Okay.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you. Thanks to all.